Apple encourages big thinking but small everything else. Meeting size is a good example. Once Chiat Day was installed as Apple's agency of record and we'd settle into our work, we would meet with Steve Jobs every other Monday. Typically, there would be no formal agenda. We'd share our work in progress with Steve, and he'd share whatever news he had. One particular day, there appeared in our midst a woman from Apple with whom I was unfamiliar. I don't recall her name, as she never appeared in our world again, so for the purpose of this tale, I'll call her Lori. She took her seat with the rest of us as Steve breezed into the boardroom, right on time. Steve was in a sociable mood, so we chatted it up for a few minutes, and then the meeting began. Before we start, let me just update you on a few things, said Steve, his eyes surveying the room. First off, let's talk about iMac. He stopped cold, his eyes locked on to the one thing in the room that didn't look right. Pointing to Lori, he said, "Who are you?" Lori was a bit stunned to be called out like that, but she calmly explained that she'd been asked to attend because she was involved with some of the marketing projects we'd been discussing. Steve heard it, processed it, then hit her with the simple stick. "I don't think we need you in this meeting, Lori. Thanks," he said. Then, as if that diversion had never occurred and as if Lori never existed, he continued with his update. So as the meeting started, in front of 8 or so people whom Steve did want at the table, poor Lori had to pack up her belongings, rise from her chair, and take the long walk across the room towards the door. Her crime, she wasn't necessary. Now, that's a story from the book that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is Insanely Simple: The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success by Ken Segall. I'm going to cover it for a few reasons, and I want to quickly talk about why I think this is such a special book. We've started to cover a handful of books about Steve Jobs, and we're covering things like I, Steve, which is this wonderful compilation of a bunch of quotes throughout his lifetime. We're covering Make Something Wonderful, which was published by Love From and is this like wonderful just dedication to who Steve was and a lot of his best ideas and speeches. We're going to cover some of his biographies, including Becoming Steve Jobs. But one of the books, there are very few books outside of kind of being explicitly about Steve, I think, that really give an insight into Apple and the culture that Steve created and helps demystify and explain some of why Apple's been able to be so successful. And I think this book I would nominate as probably the best book outside of those to understand Apple. And it's for two really important reasons. Number one, I'll give a little bit of a background on Ken Segall and talk about who he is in a moment. But what is unique about this book is it's written by someone that worked directly with Steve on very important high-profile campaigns like Think Different, who was also a part of naming the iMac and coming up with this naming framework that's now been used prolifically on iPad, iPod, iPhone. So he's actually worked with Steve, and the stories that are in this book come from all of his basically interactions with Steve. And so we get this firsthand perspective of how Steve and how Apple makes decisions and how they approach trying to define products and trying to think through things like naming or pricing. These things that can be very esoteric, can be very complex, can be very hard to wrap your head around. So that's kind of one reason. It's this kind of direct insight into what Steve was actually like. But the other is this book works really powerfully on two levels. Insanely simple. Clearly, a lot of the examples we're going to talk about here are about creative work. And, for the purpose of, from Ken's perspective, it's not so much crafting products, but it's crafting marketing campaigns, naming, pricing, and product strategy, because he was more involved in the marketing storytelling side that he was in the product creation side. But the ideas in here, I think, are applicable both when you're creating a product, whether it's a physical product, whether it's a digital product like a piece of software, but it also works at a business and strategy level. There's an entire chapter in this book called Think Phrasal, which is all about how Apple and how Ken and how Chiat Day came up with the name iMac and the incredible story behind it. We're going to cover it. It is bizarre and it is innocent. And it's kind of amazing that this has ended up carrying on still prospering decades later with Apple continuing to use the kind of iBlank naming framework. And so it's a really, really, really special book. And one of the reasons I wanted to cover it as well, too, just to give maybe a little personal anecdote. I spent a number of years working on Apple's creative team early on in my career, which was a wonderful experience. It's still, in many ways, the highlight of my experience working as a designer and as a creative. And, we had a building that was badge access that nobody could get into. And the distinct memory I have every single day going into that office for years was I would badge into the door, and in order to get into the office, I would have to pass a wall. And on that wall were 3 simple words, which were simplify, simplify, simplify. And the first two instances of that word were crossed out, almost as if it was too complicated or if it wasn't quite right. And so you're simplifying, simplifying, simplifying. And, that idea, I think, boils down the essence of what this book is trying to get across. One thing that Apple has done, I would argue better than any other company, is truly embrace simplicity as a way to attract customers, as a way to sell products, as a way to revolutionize something like the phone. In Apple's instance of iPhone was much simpler than phones, at that moment in time when it was introduced. But it also drives, I think, a lot of Apple's product strategy. It shows up in ways that Johnny Ive or Steve Jobs talked about focus and how focus was saying no to hundreds of other things so that you could say yes to just a handful of things. So it's a really powerful book. I won't belabor the point anymore, but I want to share some of those personal anecdotes. Let me just really quickly talk about who Ken is. I'm going to really quickly go through his bio because I think it's okay. So who is Ken Segall? The author of this book, Ken Segall, worked closely with Steve Jobs as an ad agency creative director, both at Next and at Apple. He was a member of the team that created Apple's legendary Think Different campaign, and he's responsible for the little I that's a part of Apple's most popular products. Having created the original iMac that introduced this naming convention, he also served as a creative director for IBM, Intel, Dell, and BMW. And the reason I share all of this is, it's really important. Like one of the defining things that I think makes this book great is that it's written by somebody who was a close collaborator on important high-profile work with Steve Jobs. So, what I want to do is kind of read through a couple of chapters where we're going to switch between like wildly different stories, from the naming of the iMac to the creation of the Think Different campaign to stories like the one I just told you at the beginning of the show, all about Lori and, being ruthless with simplicity in everything, including meeting sizes and who was attending those meetings. And at the very end, I'll come back and I'll recap some of these ideas. We'll talk about how you can harness the concept of simplicity. And the only other thing I'll say before we kick off is this book, I think, was wonderful. One of the things I'm going to try to do a better job of going forward is also being frank about what I didn't think was great in the book. And in this book, there's a handful of chapters that literally, when I got done with the chapter, I just put an X at the beginning of it because it didn't resonate with me. And it didn't resonate with me. It didn't have important ideas I thought connected. And so I'm going to cover the chapters that resonated and that I think have a lot of just really incredible value and insights in them, which is about 2/3 of the chapter in the book. But there's a couple that we're not going to cover. Chapter 7, 8, 9, and chapter 11, think casual, think human, think skeptic, think ahead. We're not going to cover those. Again, the point of this for you and for myself is that this is the very best ideas from the book distilled in a way that hopefully you can grab onto, you can come back time and time again, and you can be able to get value out of. So the way the book is structured is it's structured into kind of 10 principles. And the principles all have this kind of similar framework. It's think blank. And the first chapter is think brutal. And I'll talk through some of those ideas and we'll continue to kind of go on. And again, a lot of these ideas work on two levels. And one of the first ones is so this first chapter is think brutal, which is, interesting framing. And, the heart of it is really just that blunt is simplicity and, not being blunt or meandering is complexity. And Steve didn't like complexity. He didn't like complexity in his working relationships any more than he liked it showing up in the product. He was always going to tell you what was on his mind, and he couldn't care less how you might feel about it. And, I saw this prove out time and time and time again. I also think if you're working with someone that you trust and respect, you're totally comfortable with that communication style. And so, yes, it feels jarring from the outside looking in. I think working in closer proximity, I think it's a way that it's wonderful for everybody to show up, is just to be incredibly frank and direct about how you're feeling, but do it with compassion. And a lot of the ideas, and this is why I think this book works on multiple levels, is, simplicity is about clarity. And one of the ideas in this chapter is that clarity propels an organization. Not occasional clarity, but pervasive 24/7 in your face, take no prisoners clarity. And this is something Steve demanded. Steve demanded straightforward communication from others, and he dished it out himself. He had no patience for those who beat around the bush. He'd cut you off if you rambled. He ran his business as if there was precious little time to waste. And this idea that simplicity has a merciless side, that there's no almost when it comes to making things simpler. simplicity in many ways is brutal because it's the process of basically bashing up against these like strongly held ideas that it can't be simpler, or you can't approach it a different way. And in order to execute simplicity, I think reliably, it does require you to be merciless, and merciless at all levels. Apple's, you can read a little bit from the chapter. Apple's longtime agency, Chiat Day, is so well known for its clever T-shirts that it once published a best-of book. One of its most famous T-shirts that attempted to fight off the human instinct to settle for near perfection was a simple T-shirt that read, "Good enough is not enough," which is such a simple phrase. I tried to actually look up this series of, this best of Chiat Day T-shirts book, and I was not able to come up with anything. In fact, the only one I was able to find was T-shirts around "Good enough is not enough." But I think it's a wonderful phrase. One of the ideas as well too is, and this is again around, so it's all around this like brutal and being merciless. One of the ideas that Ken talks about in the book is that, settling for second best is a violation of the rules of simplicity. When you settle for second best, you plant the seeds for disappointment, for extra work, and for more meetings. And your challenge is really to become unbending when it comes to enforcing standards, and you have to enforce them mercilessly. In Apple's world, every manager has to be a ruthless enforcer of high standards. And I would argue that at every great company, that is exactly what happens, is the company becomes ruthless at maintaining high standards, and it becomes ruthless at holding everybody internally to high standards. You need, in my experience, for this to really work, to have a truly high performing company, whether it's Apple or sub in any other company that you respect, is there is a ruthlessness to how it's run. And in order for it to work, everybody has to show up in the same way. So the company as a whole is showing up with high standards, and every single person on the team is expected to hold those standards, maintain those standards, apply those standards in their own work. Um, and one of the things that's it was well known about Steve Jobs, is definitely shows up in the book time and time again, is that he had a huge disdain for traditional corporate cultures. And I think a lot of that was just maybe you can interpret it as a huge disdain for conventional wisdom. There's a story from the early days of Macintosh back at Chiat Day, when one of the agency guys eagerly introduced himself to Steve on the set of a shoot. "What do you do at the agency?" Steve asked. "I'm the account guy," he replied. "Oh, so you're overhead," said Steve. Though it was said in jest, Steve wasn't kidding. And there's this, this I think alludes to this like pull no punches side of Steve Jobs, where he would just call things out exactly as they were. And this is a great example. Most people would maybe not even make the connection, and they would definitely not be willing to call somebody out on a set for a team that they hired. But it's true. If you're at an agency and you're on the account side, you are technically overhead. Another good example of just Steve being ruthless and kind of brutal in his communication style and how he worked with others. Is Steve, Steve was interviewed. So it's a story from the book where Steve is basically choosing his team at Chiat Day. And so he's interviewing a candidate that would manage his global business. "So what are you doing now?" Steve asks. So Steve's asking the candidate. "I'm the global account director of Nike at Wieden & Kennedy," said our man, knowing he was holding a straight flush, just meaning that for Steve, he really respected Nike. Clearly, here's this candidate who's the global account director of Nike. Well, of course, Steve's going to like him. Steve paused. He was a big fan of the Nike brand. "Nike's been great for a long time," said Steve. "Thanks," said the candidate. "So your job is just not to fuck anything up?" Steve ended up approving of that hire. He just wanted to make sure that our man understood the difference between working on an account in serious need of help, like Apple at the time, and maintaining a piece of business where the client is already firing on all cylinders. Similarly, Steve was candid with his feedback when people were underperforming. Once he remarked, "If you can't do a better job than that, you're going to have to replace yourself." That Steve was intolerant of stupidity as a matter of record. He respectably wasn't fond of employing stupidity. So if you were on Apple's staff and wanted to retain that status, it was wise not to display your lack of smarts in a meeting with him. You just set him off and get it right between the eyes. So just to kind of recap, this first chapter is it's an intense introduction, I think, into some of the sides of Steve that are polarizing. But I think it gets at the heart of simplicity, which is, I think if I was to bubble this up to a meta level, simplicity is very hard to achieve. If you look around our world is full of just stupid amounts of complexity. And at Apple, one of the experiences I had perpetually, and it's talked about in the book, is that simplicity also isn't easier. And so in many ways you might think, which you'd be kidding yourself, that complexity is actually going to take the most work and simplicity is going to take the least work. And actually the inverse is exactly true. And the reason that it's true, Steve talks about, he has many remarkable quotes. One of the kind of analogies that he uses, metaphors he uses that I really like, is that basically getting from something complex to something simple is like peeling the layers of an onion. And that's exactly what it was like. And, being a part of Apple's creative team, you just perpetually felt like we would get incredible outcomes because we would put in more reps than almost anyone else would. And, the amount of reps that would just seem ridiculous and absurd to somebody else, just meaning, it was not uncommon at all for us to kick off a project and you would do tens, you would probably, no joke, do 30 variations, 30 versions, 30 rounds of iterations to get to the final piece of product. And you were trying to do two things at once all the time. You were trying to both find ways to like up level and maybe take something that was fine, but you thought you could frame or bring to life, meaning like just execute visually in a more compelling way. So you were trying to do that, which is almost like you're trying to maybe dial up the volume knob on these individual pieces of a given design. But the other lens we were applying ruthlessly is what could we remove or what could we merge or what could we decide to strip out entirely. And this is something that showed up many other times in my life. At Square, one of the kind of remarks and perspectives that Jack Dorsey had that I thought was just immensely right was he really encouraged everybody on the team, especially PMs, to think of themselves as editors, meaning almost like an editor at a newspaper or an editor of a book. And, and really that what was an editor doing, especially as you were bringing that skill set to being a PM, well, your job was to literally strip something down to its essence. And this is something on the creative team that we talked about all the time, that with everything that we did, our goal was really to strip it down to its essence, where you retained what made it kind of sparkle and come to life. Because you can strip something down to the point that it doesn't resonate. You can strip something down to the point of just being kind of utterly worthless, to be super frank. And so you have to strip it down, but not strip it down too much. You have to make sure that what you retain kind of sparkles and brings it to life, but you were really trying to look at the essence. And so to try to, bundle all of those thoughts together, that's how I think about what this first chapter is all about. It's about being brutal in your perspective of the world. It's about being brutal in applying standards and really high standards on yourself and your team. And that is a core piece of kind of simplifying and bringing simplicity to whatever you're doing. Okay, let's move on to the second chapter. Second idea here is all about thinking small. And again, this was the origin of that story about Lori. I'm going to try to, build off of that. But again, the chapter starts with this wonderful line that Apple encourages big thinking, but small everything else. And, just really quickly, there are many corollaries to this. Think small is like an irrefutable principle by which many incredible businesses and teams and companies have been built on. Apple had, Amazon had this kind of pizza rule where basically the teams, you always wanted a team to be small enough that you could feed that team with just one single pizza. Steve had an idea with the early Mac team that he thought it should never be bigger than 100 people. And very clearly today, the team is definitely bigger than 100 people, meaning the team of engineers and hardware designers that's working on Mac. But in the early days, Steve had this ruthless perspective that it was a 100-person team. He never wanted the team to be any bigger. And if they wanted to add somebody to the team, they'd have to remove somebody to the team. And, so we're going to talk about how thinking small applies to the creative process. But again, one of the stories, the story that the chapter starts off with is basically this meeting, so Steve's going into one of his regular creative reviews with Chiat Day. He'd have this every single week with them. And he identifies that there's somebody in the room that he's never seen before and calls her out. And basically she, gives what in many other companies would be a perfectly fine reason to stay in the meeting, which is, hey, somebody told me about this. I'm working on another piece of this. I want to be a part of this conversation. At 99% of other companies, that would be completely acceptable. But again, at Apple, just standards were ruthlessly applied. And it also introduces a concept that appears in the book many other times, which is the simple stick, which is this kind of Steve going into conversations or going into decisions and hitting a team or hitting an idea with the simple stick. And basically just time and time and time again being like, it should be simpler. Make it simpler. That's way too complex. Or in this instance, he hit Lori with the simple stick and basically said, I don't think you're needed in this meeting, and literally moved on mid-meeting. And so I'm going to go back to the book because I think it connects it with some other principles that I think help us understand why Steve did this and why this was a good thing. Her crime, she wasn't necessary. What Lori experienced was a strict enforcement of one of simplicity's most important rules. Start with small groups of smart people and keep them small. Every time the body count goes higher, you're simply inviting complexity to take a seat at the table. Such a good line. So I'm going to have to say this again because this is one of the best ideas. Start with small groups of smart people and keep them small. Every time the body count goes higher, you're simply inviting complexity to take a seat at the table. The small group principle is deeply woven into the religion of simplicity. It's key to Apple's ongoing success and key to any organization that wants to nurture quality thinking. There's no such thing as a mercy invitation. Either you're critical to the meeting or you're not. It's nothing personal, it's just business. When Steve called a meeting or reported to a meeting, his expectation was that everyone in the room would be an essential participant. Spectators were not welcome. And all I'm going to say to add on to this is everybody listening should apply this in whatever you're doing, whatever companies you're running, whatever meetings you're running, and the way that you show up at work. I have found this to be absolutely true. But it's again, like, and this is one of the reasons I think this book is wonderful. All of these ideas are very simple and they honestly feel common sense. But what's also true is that most ideas that feel simple and feel like something that's is just like inevitable, like, of course you should do that. These are also the things that you have to literally bring energy into every meeting that you go into. Enough energy, not just to participate, but to be able to call out who's not in the room or to be able to drop someone from the invite. And it's very, very, very hard to do. And so I encourage everybody to bring this to the way that you show up, bring this into the way that you hold meetings. Your work will be better for it. Complexity normally offers the easy way out. Simplicity is never achieved through expectations. Truthfully, you can do a brutal thing without being brutal. Just explain your reasons, keep the group small. Over the years, Apple's marketing group has fine-tuned a process that's been successfully repeated revolution by revolution. Project teams are kept small with talented people being given real responsibility, which is what drives them to work some crazy hours and deliver quality thinking because quality is stressed over quantity. Meetings are informal and visible progress is made on a weekly, if not daily basis. I'm going to do a quick aside. One essay, I guess technically it's a speech or a talk given by Ed Catmull that I want to do very soon is about keeping your mistakes small. And it talks about really the creative process at Pixar that Ed Catmull and Steve, helped create. And, this idea of like informal meetings and visible progress being made. This is very true. At Apple, when we were doing creative work, when we were doing on some sort of, creative project, and this project could be spanning 4 or 5 months, we would do creative reviews every single day in some form or fashion. And, at Pixar, one of the immutable laws that they have that they've that they've arrived at over time and enforce ruthlessly is just this idea that the team, if you're on a movie, if you're on a project, you will look at work that's happening every single day. And, again, this sounds very simple. It sounds very straightforward. It's also very hard it's very hard to create and it's very hard to enforce. And the reason is for really 2 reasons. One, the subtext of creative reviews is that you're judging creative work. And most people's interpretation of that is that you're actually judging the person that created it. And I think one key unlock to really being able to do daily reviews in a great way is making sure that, and I'll talk about in a second a couple of tactics we would use, but making sure that, the discussion is about the work and not about someone's contribution to the work. And, a really simple example that I give whenever I talk about this, and, I would encourage everybody here that does creative reviews, and that could be something as silly as you're sitting down with someone on your team thinking through a plan and you want to give feedback on it, or you're literally reviewing a piece of creative work. Could be a design for a logo or a product. But one of the techniques we would use is just doing reviews by asking great questions. And this sounds really silly, but what I have found to be extremely true is when I talk with people about what the purpose of a creative review is, most people think that it's to basically cast judgment. Like it's, if I'm the stakeholder or if I'm someone who's making the final call, creative reviews are really where I cast judgment on the work. And I say, I don't like this. I like this. That actually, I think, is the completely wrong way to think about a creative review. And I'll tell you why. When you treat a creative review as casting judgment, you are only ever going to be as smart as whoever is casting that judgment. And I would, say that even the best people I've worked with are very volatile in terms of their judgment. What you want to create is an environment that where intense questioning and curiosity is rewarded and is encouraged. And so, one of the really simple things we would do at Apple, and I apply this today, is when we did creative reviews, I would say 10% or less of the conversation was about what we liked or didn't like, and was kind of from a judgmental perspective. The vast majority of the conversation was asking questions. And so as an example, if you were looking at something and say you didn't like the color, you wouldn't say, I don't like that color. You would say, as I'm looking at this page, one of the things that's catching my eye is that we're using, say, this color purple in the hero. Is that the right color? Is that what we should be using? How do we arrive at that? And what's amazing is if you make that small tweak, as opposed to casting judgment, you're asking questions, it unlocks, I think, a world of possibilities, and it creates an environment where the work can just get better and better and better. But it also creates an environment where everyone is, you're naturally and continuously creating alignment, because you're talking about the work constantly and you're all netting out, or at least you understand the rationale behind why you're making the decisions you're making. Weird aside, I'm going to cover this essay, this speech from Ed Catmull, but it applies here. At Apple, they have this ruthless process that's not, it's not anything crazy, but one of the pieces of it is just meetings are informal. They're discussions. It's not formal reviews. And you want to see visible progress. Back to the book. Most businesses follow an instinctive but misguided principle. The more crucial the project, the more people must be thrown at it. The operative theory is that more brains equals more ideas. That's hard to argue with, except that only occasionally do more brains mean better ideas. I love this perspective. To say that putting more people on a project will improve the results is basically saying that you don't have confidence in the group you started with. Either that, or you're just looking for an insurance policy, which also means you don't have a lot of confidence in the group you started with. What you're really saying is that you don't have the right people on the job. So fix that. Again, so simple, very, very, very challenging to do, and to do tactfully and to do well and to do consistently. The quality of work resulting from a project is inversely proportional to the number of people involved in a project. I wouldn't say that that's true all of the time, but I would say in creative work especially, and in work that's exploratory or novel, or you're trying to do something truly new, you're trying to take something from 0 to 1 that's very different from what exists today, that is absolutely true. The quality of work resulting from a project increases in direct proportion to the degree of involvement by the ultimate decision maker. Steve understood and appreciated the creative process, which in certain ways is the relative absence of process. He got that ideas needed to be nurtured and protected. He knew that machine-like analysis would not magically yield creative brilliance. He knew that if he enabled a small group of smart people, good things would happen, even if those results weren't entirely predictable. So that entire chapter is just basically applying the concept that you want to, I think these are linked. Like the first chapter is all about being brutal in terms of applying standards. And I think one of those standards is you want to always think small. You want to have small groups of smart people. You want to push people to create something with the minimum amount of resources needed to do that. And just this idea that I think that yields better work. In my experience, it's absolutely true. I wouldn't say it's true for everything. It's not true for something. I think there are some things that are complicated enough which you need to have, a broader group. But for critical decisions, for really difficult or really novel things, a small group of smart people held to high standards is absolutely the right way to go. Building off on that, there's another chapter that follows it, which is all about thinking minimal, which is similar but different. I'm going to share one of the stories. In 1997, at Apple's annual WWDC event, Steve shared his beliefs around simplicity. This is Steve talking. People think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on. But that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that there are. You have to pick carefully. I'm actually as proud of the things we haven't done as the things we have done. Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. Love this. One of the great anecdotes is very, very Steve response. But one of the great anecdotes in the book is when Mike Parker, who was the former president and CEO of Nike, asked Steve for advice about where to take Nike. And Steve volunteered the following advice, which is ruthlessly simple. Nike makes some of the best products in the world, products you lust after, just absolutely beautiful, stunning products, but you also make a lot of crap. Just get rid of the crappy stuff and focus on the good stuff. What's amazing here is, if you go and do a little bit of homework about when Steve came back to Apple, this is exactly what Steve went and did. He basically, went and looked at the product line, realized that most of it was absolute shit, got rid of that and started off on a new set of products. Basically, kept the products that were good and started off on a new set of products with at least a 6-month lead time. That was also the reason that the Think Different campaign was created. Was Steve came back, he knew that it was going to take time to fix the product lineup, and so he needed to be able to create some, positive sentiment, so, reinvest in the brand, give people something to be excited about as it related to Apple, as he was fixing the products and getting stuff back that people would actually like. As Steve often said, Apple is very good at saying no. It actively resists the temptation to make new products simply because it can. And one of the anecdotes here, and I thought these were kind of, beautiful, and this is the parts of the book that work at the business and strategic level, is kind of reflecting on two things, which is, one of the problems that most successful companies face is this product proliferation, just having way too many products. And another, issue, and I've seen this countless times myself, is getting overly complex with who your target customer is. And we'll talk about it in a second, but if you go and look at Apple's website, say go on any page, one of the things that is actually remarkable if you stop and think about it is that Apple could have different copy for college students, different copy for professionals, different copy for people that work at home. It serves, look at any instance, look at like like a computer as an example. You could, like an iMac is a professional computer. You could use it at your office. You could use it at home. You could imagine two completely different marketing stories just focused on office versus home. Similarly, take the MacBook Pro and you could think about talking to different people that use it. People that use it just for spreadsheets and browsing, people that use it for complex software. What's amazing is that Apple merges these all down into a single customer profile. And because of that, they can keep their marketing messaging really simple. So we'll come to that in a second. Let's talk about product proliferation. Many companies can't stop themselves from responding to every opportunity. Again, this goes back to this idea of Steve having to be really good at saying no, Apple having to be really good at saying no. And this stems from trying to please every customer and close every sale, when in fact, most companies would be better served by making their product lineup logical and easier to navigate. Choosing the path of simplicity, Apple elects to do just a few things, but do them incredibly well. It builds a large and loyal following, not because of the products it can make, but because of the products it chooses to make. It makes premium products only. It's happy to cede the market for low-end products to anyone who cares to take it. Let's talk about, simplifying the target customer. So this is giving an anecdote of basically Apple's approach at a time when Dell and IBM were powerhouses. And today that's not so much the case. And so it's a little bit of a different time. The PC companies at the time were churning out different models for small business, big business, education, government, and consumers of every stripe. They offer more choices now than ever before and make little profit on each. Apple, anchored by its belief in simplicity, has evolved in a very different way. Rather than splinter its computer marketing efforts among many different types of customers, it generally focuses on one. It simply sees customers as people. It markets its product based on the belief that its customers aren't looking for a great home computer or a great business computer. They're looking for a great computer, period. It's a vastly simpler way to sell a product, more cost efficient as well. Apple's one marketing message serves all, giving customers credit for having the intelligence to self-select the model that best meets their needs. Some home users may feel they need the high-powered Pro machine. Some business users may feel they need the basic entry model. All's good. Remember, being complicated is easy. It's simplicity that requires serious work. Minimizing product lines and consolidating target audiences requires an organization that's willing to take a long, hard look at itself. Steve looked at pretty much everything with the idea of cutting it down to its essence. Whether it was a new product or a new ad, he had an instant allergic reaction to any suggestions that might add complication. One of the things here we'll talk about, so this is another wonderful story. And again, this is why I love that the book's written by someone who closely collaborated with Steve on ambitious things where you have to make these really tough calls, and including calls that can feel very risky in the moment. that you have to have the conviction are going to pay off and that the risks are going to be worth it. And so these are judgment calls, they're subjective. It's very difficult. One of the other points that I'll get to the story right after this. One of the other points related to this that I just want to call out is one of the points that Ken makes, which I really appreciated, is that simplicity is brutally difficult, and it's brutally difficult for everyone, including Steve. And so this story is going to be an instance where Steve struggles with simplicity, and so in most cases he is the champion of simplicity and he's rooting for simplicity, but it's hard, and there are times where you do, all of us will fall prey to the siren song of complexity. It's in this one instance is going to be better if I don't approach simplicity. This is a great story about that. Human beings are a funny lot. Give them one idea and they nod their heads. Give them five and they simply scratch their heads. Or even worse, they forget you mentioned all those ideas in the first place. Minimizing is the key to making a point stick. Though this is common sense, it may also be the most violated principle in marketing or any other business. Your point will be more quickly understood and more easily remembered if you don't clutter it up with other points. Your point will be more quickly understood and more easily remembered if you don't clutter it up with other points. Strangely, some of the most brilliant people on earth sometimes need to be reminded. At one agency meeting with Steve Jobs, we were reviewing the content of a proposed iMac commercial when a debate arose about how much we should say in the commercial. The creative team was arguing that it would work best if the entire spot was devoted to describing the one key feature of this particular iMac. Steve, however, had it in his head that there were 4 or 5 really important things to say. It seemed to him that all those copy points would fit comfortably in a 30-second ad. After debating the issue for a few minutes, it didn't look like Steve was going to budge. That's when a little voice started to make itself heard inside the head of Lee Clow, who is the leader at Chiat Day. And Lee Clow is legendary. At some point, I hope to do a book or a profile on him, but I haven't had a chance yet. So Lee Clow is making an appearance in this story. He decided this would be a good time to give Steve a live demonstration. Lee tore 5 sheets of paper off his notepad. Yes, notepad. Lee was laptop resistant at the time, and crumpled them into 5 balls. Once the crumpling was complete, he started his performance. "Here, Steve, catch," said Lee as he tossed a single ball of paper across the table. Steve caught it no problem and tossed it back. "That's a good ad," said Lee. "Now catch this," he said, as he threw all 5 paper balls in Steve's direction. Steve didn't catch a single one, and they bounced on the table and floor. "That's a bad idea," said Lee. People will always respond better to a single idea expressed clearly. They will tune out when complexity begins to speak instead. When in doubt, minimize. It's such a great principle. When in doubt, minimize. One of the other chapters that I really liked is about this idea of thinking motion, which is get to in a second, but I think it talks about how just the need to be able to sustain kind of a fever pitch in the work and a need to sustain progress, and basically to push, as always, between time and resources and what you want to try to create. When Steve Jobs retook the helm at Apple, the biggest problem was the product line. When he told what he told us was consistent with what he had said in a Business Week interview right before he'd agreed to return. The products suck. There's no sex in them anymore. Common sense often says that when it's time to accelerate the decision process, it's time to apply the best tool available, which is a small group of smart people. Leonard Bernstein captured this idea perfectly when he said, "To achieve great things, 2 things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time." I found the perfect amount of time to be about 3 months. Any less time and we'd compromise on quality. Any more time and we'd invite overthinking. And I think I'll just a quick aside on this. This is there is absolutely a fulcrum between basically underinvesting, which is spending too little time on a problem, which is where you are absolutely the choice that you're making at the end of the day is you're compromising on quality because you have, if you have sufficiently high standards in terms of what you want to ship, you need to back that up. And one of the things that you need to back that up and be able to deliver is enough time for exploration, iteration, and to get to something that's really special. Because again, as we talked about at the beginning, getting to something special takes more work. Getting to something really simple that resonates takes more work. It takes more time and energy. And on the other end of the spectrum, and I love that Ken called this out, you can also invest too much time. And what the end output of too much time is absolutely overthinking. And what's bad about overthinking is when you overthink, you question your decisions, you start to iterate on things that are perfectly fine. And basically the way that I've seen that show up is, say you'll spend another 3 or 4 weeks, and those 3 or 4 weeks might move the needle 1% positively. Sometimes it'll move it negatively. And when you're in that realm, you're definitely overthinking. So I just love, this idea of connecting these ideas of Leonard Bernstein's, to achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. And then this idea that, in Ken's experience at Apple, found that 3 months was about right. And in my experience creatively, if you're working on something sufficiently ambitious, 3 months feels pretty great. Um, Interesting. Uh, Bernstein's quote cites two essential elements of achieving greatness. Those apply well to Apple's world along with addendums. One, again, aim unrealistically high. When Apple created the first iPod, it didn't set out to create a portable player that could accommodate music, movies, podcasts, and photos. It created a music player. The rest would come later. In other words, don't overreach. It's important to achieve greatness, but your project has to end on time and deliver what you've promised. Obviously, you shouldn't underreach either. You can't be so realistic that you produce something lackluster. Again, you have to find that fulcrum point. This is a balancing act between these two extremes, and it's your job to find that day in and day out. And the second principle, never stop moving. The project begins on day one and should consume people from the get-go. No timeouts allowed. Only when people are kept in constant motion do they stay focused with the right kind of intensity. Work isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be gratifying. Fucking love those two sentences. Work isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be gratifying. Concentrating, and in this I love. So it's talking about, part of Apple's simplicity is that the first version of products will be revolutionary from a product experience perspective, but honestly underwhelming, especially in hindsight, as you see future iterations in terms of what it delivers for like functionality. And it's really interesting just to think about that for a second. But one of the insights in the book that I love is about why this is a benefit. And I thought this was just so well said. Again, speaks to strategy and why simplicity is important from a strategic perspective as well. Concentrating on building the best possible 1.0 product gives Apple a number of advantages beyond scheduling. It normally allows the company to create a product that's not only revolutionary, but illuminates an even more exciting path ahead. A good example is iPhone. The 1.0 version of this product didn't even support apps, which quickly came to be the most revolutionary part of the platform. The original idea was that Apple would support only web apps developed in Safari. Creating products this way gives Apple the ability to recycle its leadership. Apple creates this revolution, then while its competitors are working to catch up to the 1.0 version, it's already at work on the 2.0 version. Year after year, as long as Apple continues to innovate, it has the opportunity to renew its leadership. Apple also gets an interesting marketing advantage from these cycles as well. Since it falls upon Apple's competitors to prove they've created a better device, they normally gravitate towards specification-heavy advertising. They feel obligated to point out that they have more megapixels, more USB ports, more whatever. Meanwhile, Apple continues to market its products, to make its products as it always has, in an emotional, human manner, pointing out benefits rather than specs. One of my favorite quotes from Steve, just a perspective that he had, was that Apple couldn't compete on speeds and feeds, which was, it's kind of buzzwords for, again, you don't want to be competing on specs. You want to be competing on the totality of the product. You want to be competing on the product experience. That's one really important if you're going to capture the luxury market or the high-end market, which is Apple's, one and only strategy. It'll cede the low end of the market to everybody else. So it's important to capture that high end of the product of the market. But again, I just love this idea that when you can create this cycle of introducing revolutionary products, your competitors then have to market based off comparison. And the only way to do that is to basically lean into, individual like data points that where they have some sort of an advantage. And it's typically something that never resonates with consumers. I just think it's like such a interesting and well-made point. Unless it currently has a breathtaking technology, Apple takes itself out of the spec comparison game and makes more meaningful connections with its customers. Okay, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the Think Different campaign. And this whole chapter is about thinking iconic. And it's a little esoteric in some of what we're going to read. This is one of those that I think the examples resonate. I don't know if the ideas resonate. So I'll make the point this way. This is how I think about this Think Iconic principle. One of the things that Apple has always done a very good job of is creating iconic imagery and iconic products and iconic headlines to market their products. What do I mean by that? Well, take an example of like the initial iPod campaign that was basically a human silhouette with a white cable, which was this defining aspect early on of the iPod, and earbuds, and somebody dancing. It's interesting because it is iconic, meaning one that it is it's singular. There's no other brand that's created a campaign like that. It's iconic in that it's basically, again, going to that, like, getting out of the spec comparison game and making a human connection. People didn't care. People by and large don't care about speeds and feeds. They care about the totality of the product and the experience, and they care about what it delivers. And it was such a great example of Apple realizing that what people wanted was music because of how it made them feel, because everybody loves music and their own types of music. We all have a connection with it, and it marketed that. It marketed and communicated from that perspective. And so, thinking iconic is definitely a muscle that Apple has developed. It's a muscle that they've developed to communicate the benefits of their product, and it's a muscle they've developed in terms of, like, creating and sculpting products that literally the form factor itself, the UI itself, is iconic. So we're going to talk about some examples, mostly around the Think Different campaign. The Think Different ads were a vivid reminder that a single iconic image can be the most powerful form of communication. As we developed the campaign, each ad consisted of one black and white portrait of an Apple hero, bleeding off all sides of the page, with nothing more than the Apple logo and the words "Think Different" placed tastefully in a corner. On television, the commercial that launched the campaign similarly used black and white film clips that captured the spirit of each individual. Over this series of images, Richard Dreyfuss read a script that praised the crazy ones who dared to see things differently. The Think Different campaign couldn't have been simpler. No matter where those black and white images appeared, in magazines, on posters, and on billboards, they registered with viewers in a nanosecond. And one of the things in this chapter that I really enjoyed is, so it's all about the Think Different campaign, but it's actually it just has the text. So this is what Steve Jobs said when he introduced the Think Different campaign at what I believe was WWDC. To me, marketing is about values. This is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world, and we're not going to get a chance to get people to remember much about us. No company is. And so we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us. Now, Apple, fortunately, is one of the half a dozen best brands in the whole world, right up there with Nike, Disney, Coke, Sony. It's one of the greats of the greats, not just in this country, but all around the globe. But even a great brand needs investment and caring if it's going to retain its relevance and vitality, and the Apple brand has clearly suffered from neglect in this area in the last few years. We need to bring it back. The way to do that is not to talk about speeds and feeds. It's not to talk about MIPS and megahertz. It's not to talk about why we're better than Windows. The dairy industry tried for 20 years to convince you that milk was good for you. It's a lie, but they tried anyway. Audience laughs, and the sales have gone down like this. Got Milk doesn't even talk about the product. Matter of fact, the focus is on the absence of the product. But the best example of all, and one of the greatest jobs of marketing that the universe has ever seen, is Nike. Remember, Nike sells a commodity. They sell shoes. And yet, when you think of Nike, you feel something different than a shoe company. In their ads, as you know, they don't ever talk about the product. They don't ever tell you about their air soles or why they're better than Reebok's air soles. What does Nike do in their advertising? They honor great athletes and they honor great athletics. That's who they are. That's what they're all about. Apple spends a fortune on advertising. You'd never know it. So when I got here, Apple had just fired their agency and was in a competition with 23 agencies that, 4 years from now, they'd pick one. And we blew that up and we hired Chiat Day, the ad agency that I was fortunate enough to work with years ago, who created some award-winning work, including the commercial voted the best ad ever made, 1984, by advertising professionals. And we started working with that agency again. And the question we asked was, our customers want to know, who is Apple and what is it that we stand for? Where do we fit in this world? And what we're about isn't making boxes for people to get their jobs done. Although we do that well. We do that better than almost anybody in some cases. But Apple is about something more than that. Apple, at the core, its core value is that we believe that people with passion can change the world for the better. That's what we believe. And that those people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that actually do. And so what we're going to do in our first brand marketing campaign in several years is to get back to that core value. A lot of things have changed. The market is a totally different place from where it was a decade ago. And Apple is totally different. And Apple's place in it is totally different. But values, core values, those things shouldn't change. The things that Apple believed in at its core are the same things that Apple really stands for today. And so we wanted to find a way to communicate this. And what we have is something that I'm very moved by. It honors those people who change the world. Some of them are living, some of them are not. But the ones that aren't, as you'll see, you know that if they've ever used a computer, it would have been a Mac. The theme of the campaign is Think Different, honoring the people who think different and who move this world forward. And it is what we are about. It touches the soul of this company. I hope you feel the same way about it that I do. Um, incredible speech, incredibly true, incredibly resonant even to today. Some more commentary about this. A company facing extinction will normally do whatever it takes to keep itself alive. Anything except increasing marketing costs, of course. So it takes a large degree of nerve to pour a good chunk of what's left into something as intangible as a new brand campaign. But that's just what Steve did. In a certain way, he seemed to feel liberated by Apple's predicament. He made it clear that Apple couldn't be withdrawing into a shell at a time like this. Now was its last chance to get out there and put its stake in the ground. The company had to invest in itself, and invest Steve did. And again, this is commentary on Think Different. If you think about where the company was when it came up with this campaign, it was facing extinction. Steve came back as an interim CEO and wouldn't become CEO for a very long time later. And he was in the process of rebooting the company, and the prospects were extremely grim. And so, I think this is just a point wonderfully made that Apple's always been great at marketing, and marketing is what the company's built a lot of success on, marketing and creating breakthrough products. And Apple made a call that most companies would not have made, which was to invest in marketing, branding, and advertising at a time where most other people, especially a CFO, would say we shouldn't do that. Talks a little bit about the tactics Apple used. By saying fewer things in more important places, Apple seemed to get more notice than companies like IBM, which had a vastly larger marketing budget. Again, your budget doesn't matter. It's how you apply it. Chiat's media chief, Monica Caro, made sure that the Think Different campaign appeared only in those places where it would achieve maximum notice, and never in places that would degrade the message. These portraits of Think Different heroes never ran on the inside pages of a magazine. They ran only on back covers, where they would shine on their own. But it was out in the real world that the ads had such a commanding presence. Billboards became a huge part of the effort, but only in the most prime locations. Apple started systematically locking up the most visible billboard locations all over the United States as they became available, near airports, approaches to major cities, etc. Selling a brand campaign to a client is often like selling a 19-year-old on the benefits of starting a retirement account. The gains are just too far off in the future. They're in business to make money now. I'm going to go ahead and pause this episode for now. This is going to be part 1 of Insanely Simple. Again, this is episode 173, and you can find the show notes, including everything that I've talked through, all of my notes and takeaways for the book. It's 35 pages printed out. You can find this online at outlieracademy.com/insanely simple. I'll be back with part 2.